Hi, welcome back to Storytime. So, we are in part 9, technically. I think it's probably about part 7 or so, but a couple of my streams got chopped in half because of a lot of dropped frames. Knocking on wood that it looks like we're going to keep our signal today, but we'll see. And Maestro's decided he's not going to join us yet. He's sulky whenever I stream. We are really close to the end, so it looks like we'll be able to finish 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in the next 2 streams. The second stream might go long, might go short. We will see. Let's see, we're at page 265 right now, so we'll see on what page we end today's stream. Anyways, let's go ahead and get started. We're in part 2, chapter 14, The South Pole. I hurried to the platform. Yes, the water was clear of ice, with the exception of the few scattered pieces and moving icebergs. In the distance, a long extent of open sea. Birds filled the air. Fish crowded the sea, which, according to its depth, varied from an intense blue to an olive green. The thermometer marked 3 degrees centigrade below zero. This was, comparatively speaking, spring, shut up behind the icebergs whose distant masses were visible on the northern horizon. "Are we at the pole?" I asked with a beating heart. "I do not know," he said. "I will take the bearings at noon." "But shall we be able to see the sun through the fog?" I asked, looking at the dull gray sky. "If he shine out ever so little, it will suffice," said the captain. 10 miles to the southward, a solitary islet rose to a height of 200 yards. We advanced towards it cautiously, for it might have been surrounded by shoals. An hour later, we had reached it. 2 hours after that, we had explored it. It was between 4 and 5 miles in circumference. A narrow canal separated it from a large tract of land of which I could not see the whole extent. The existence of this land appeared to confirm Maury's theory. That ingenious American had stated that between the South Pole and the 60th parallel, the sea is covered with floating ice of great size, which is never met with in the North Atlantic. From this fact, he had deduced the conclusion that the Antarctic Circle encloses large tracts of land, since the icebergs cannot form in the open sea, but only on a coast. According to his calculations, the mass of ice surrounding the South Pole forms an enormous cap extending about 2,400 miles. Meanwhile, the Nautilus, for fear of striking, stopped at 3 cables' length from a beach crowned by a splendid mass of rock. The boat was launched. The captain, 2 men carrying the instruments, Conseil, and I embarked. It was 10 o'clock. I had not seen Ned Land. He probably did not wish to stultify himself in the presence of the South Pole. Stultify, that's an interesting word. A few strokes brought us to land. Conseil was about to jump ashore, but I restrained him. "Sir," said I to Captain Nemo, "to you belongs the honor of the first landing on this ground." "Yes," replied the captain, "and if I do not hesitate to tread this polar soil, it is because no man has ever landed here before." As he ceased speaking, he leaped lightly ashore. His heart was beating with strong emotion. He climbed a rock which terminated in a little promontory, and there, with folded arms, with eager look, motionless and silent, he seemed to take possession of those southern regions. After 5 minutes he returned to us. "Now, Professor, when you please," he cried. I then disembarked, followed by Conseil, leaving the 2 sailors in the boat. For some distance, the soil appeared to be composed of tufa, of a reddish color, sometimes like powdered bricks. Scoriae, lava streams, and pumice stone covered it. We could not mistake its volcanic origin. In some places arose a light smoke, which emitted a smell of sulphur, thereby attesting that these subterranean fires had lost none of their expansive power. However, having ascended a high pinnacle of rock, I could perceive no volcano. We know that in these regions James Ross discovered the craters of Erebus and Terror in full activity in the 167th meridian in latitude 77 degrees 32 minutes south. Hi, Reaper. Good to see you. The vegetation appeared very limited. Some lichens of the Unsnea melanxantha kind spread over the black rocks. Some microscopic plants, rudimentary diatomas, a kind of cells placed between two quartz shells, the long purple and scarlet fucus supported by their little swimming bladders which the surf carried to the shore, composed all the Niagara flora of this region. Or maybe it is just meager. I've never seen it spelled that way. The beach was covered with mollusks, small mussels, limpets, smooth heart-shaped bucards, and particularly Cleos with oblong and membranous bodies, whose heads were formed of two rounded lobes. There were myriads of northern Cleos, about an inch long, of which a whale would swallow a world at one gulp. These charming pteropods, perfect sea butterflies, gave animation to the shore. Amongst other zoophytes appeared in the higher levels some arborescent corals of the species which, according to James Ross, lives in the Antarctic Sea at 1,000 feet deep. Then there were little alkyors belonging to the species Procelia pelagica, and also a number of asteroids particular to those climates, and starfish. But it was in the air that life was so prolific. Thousands of birds flew and wheeled around us, deafening us with their cries. Others crowded upon the rock and watched us pass without fear, and even came close to our feet. There were penguins, so agile in the water that they have been mistaken for the active bonitos, and yet so very heavy and clumsy on shore. They uttered harsh cries and formed a numerous assemblage, quiet in their movements, but wonderful as to clamor. Amongst the birds I recognized the Chiones of the family of waders. It is as large as a penguin, white, with a short and pointed beak, with a red circle round the eye. Conseil laid in a stock of these, for, properly prepared, these birds are very good to eat. Albatrosses flew about, the width of their expanded wings being fully 12 feet. Oh, hi, Drank. Yes, it did just start. They are rightly called the ocean vultures. Gigantic petrels, amongst others, the Quebontre huesas, with curved wings. These birds are great eaters of seals. Some damiers, a kind of small duck, the upper part of whose bodies is black and white, a quantity of petrels, some white with brown bordered wings, some blue, peculiar to the Antarctic seas, and so full of oil, I told Conseil, that the inhabitants of the Faroe Islands have only to insert a wick in their bodies before lighting them. My word. A very little more, and they would be perfect lamps, replied Conseil, so we can scarcely expect nature to have furnished them with wicks at first. After half a mile, the ground was riddled with ruff's nests. It was laying ground, and from which many birds were escaping. Captain Nemo caused some hundreds to be hunted down, for their flesh is tasty. They uttered a cry somewhat similar to the bray of an ass. They are about as large as a goose, body of a slaty color, white underneath, with a yellow ring round the neck. They were killed with stones without making any attempt to escape. All this time the fog hung over us, and at 11 a.m. the sun had not shone out. His absence caused me some uneasiness, for without his appearance we could get no observation. How then could we ascertain whether we had reached the pole? When I rejoined Captain Nemo, I found him leaning against a rock, gazing at the sky. He seemed impatient, worried. But what was to be done? He could not command the sun like the sea. Midday arrived, and the sun had not appeared for a moment. We could not even see its position through the fog, and the fog soon turned to snow. "Tomorrow," the captain said calmly, and we returned to the Nautilus. During our absence the nets had been drawn, and I noticed with much interest the fish that had been captured, which are chiefly migrants from less elevated zones. I tasted some of them subsequently and found them insipid, notwithstanding Conseil's opinion, for he liked them. The snowstorm continued till next day. It was impossible to remain on the platform. Even in the saloon, when I stayed to make notes of the excursion, I could hear the cries of the petrels and albatrosses sporting in the storm. The Nautilus did not remain at anchor, but went down the coast about 10 miles to the south in the midst of the twilight left by the sun as it touched the horizon. Next day, 20th of March, the snow had ceased to fall. The cold was rather more intense. The thermometer was 2 degrees below zero. The mists were lifting, and I was in hopes that today we should be able to take the observations. Captain Nemo not having yet appeared, the boat took Conseil and myself ashore. The soil was of the same nature, volcanic. All round were traces of lava, scoriae, and basalt, although I could see no crater. Here, lower down, myriads of birds enlivened the scene, but their dominion was there divided, with troops of marine mammifers which gazed at us from their soft eyes. There were various species of seals, some extended on the ground, others on the ice, many plunging in and emerging from the water. They did not move at our approach, never having before encountered man. And I calculated that there were sufficient to fill hundreds of ships. "Faith," said Conseil, "it is a very good thing that Ned Land did not come with us." "Why, Conseil?" "Because he would have killed all these." "All of them?" "That is saying a great deal. But I do not think we should have been able to prevent our Canadian friend from harpooning some of these splendid cetaceans. That would have annoyed Captain Nemo, for he does not spill the blood of inoffensive animals wantonly." "He is quite right." "Certainly, Conseil, but tell me, have you not already classed these magnificent species of specimens of marine fauna?" "Monsieur knows," replied Conseil, "that I am not well up on it. When Monsieur has told me the names of the animals, they are seals and morses," I said. "Two genus which belong to the family of pinnipeds," said Conseil. "Order carnivorous, group Unguiculus, subclass Monodelphians, class Mammifer, branch Vertebrates." "Good, Conseil," I replied. "But these two genus are divided into species, and, if I am not mistaken, we shall here have the opportunity to observe them. Let us get on." It was now 8 a.m. We had 4 hours before the sun could be observed with advantage. I therefore advanced towards a large bay which has hollowed itself out in the granite cliffs. There, as far as we could see, the earth and ice fragments were absolutely covered with marine mammifers, and I looked involuntarily for Proteus, the mythological shepherd who guarded Neptune's immense flock. The seals were most numerous. They formed distinct groups, males and females, the fathers watching the family, the mothers suckling the young, some of which were sufficiently strong to walk a little. When any of the animals wished to move, they went along by little jumps due to the contraction of the body, and they helped themselves along awkwardly enough by means of their fin, which, as in the Lamentine, Their congener forms a perfect forearm. In the water, their element, the spine is mobile and they are admirably adapted for swimming, the skin being smooth and the feet webbed. When resting upon the ground, their attitudes are extremely graceful. So the ancients, observing their expressive faces, soft looks, which even a beautiful woman cannot surpass, the clear and limpid eyes, their charming positions, and the poetry of their manners, metamorphosed the males into Titans and the females into Sirens. I called Conseil's attention to the great development of the brain lobes of these interesting animals. No mammal, except man, has such a development of cerebral material. Thus, seals are capable of receiving a certain amount of education. They are easily domesticated, and I agree with some naturalists that, if properly taught, they could be easily utilized as fishing dogs. The greater number of the seals were asleep on the rock or on the sand. Amongst the seals proper, which have no external ears, in which they differ from the others whose ears are prominent, I observed several varieties of the Stenorhynchi, about 9 feet long, white, with bulldog heads, armed with 10 teeth in each jaw, 4 incisors above and below, and 2 great canine teeth, shaped like the fleur-de-lis. Amongst them, sea elephants moved about. They were a kind of seal, having soft, flexible trunks, and the giants of the species measured 20 feet round and more than 30 feet long. They did not move as we approached them. "Are these creatures dangerous?" asked Conseil. "Not if they are not molested," I replied. "When a seal is obliged to defend her young, her rage is terrific, and they frequently break the fishing boats to pieces." "And quite right, too," replied Conseil. "I will not contradict you." 2 miles farther, we were stopped by a promontory which sheltered the bay from the south winds. It fell perpendicularly to the sea, which formed round the base in surf. Beyond it, we heard loud bellows. "Hullo!" cried Conseil. "There's a concert of bulls." "No," said I. "It is a Morse concert." "Are they fighting?" "Either that or playing." "I should like to see them," said Conseil. "We must have a look at them, Conseil, certainly." We commenced our ascent for the black rocks and got many a tumble over the slippery stones. More than once I rolled over, and to the detriment of my ribs. Conseil, more prudent or more steady, did not fall and was ready to help me up, saying, "If monsieur would take longer steps, he would keep his balance better." The Morses resembled seals in form and the arrangement of their members, but the canine incisor teeth were wanting in the lower jaw, and the superior canines are 2 long tusks. These teeth are of ivory, harder than that of the elephant, and less likely to become yellow, and are much sought after. So Morses are an object for the hunter, and they will soon become exterminated, as the fishers kill indiscriminately, females and young, upwards of 4,000 every year. We passed close to these curious animals, and I was enabled to examine them at leisure. Their skins are thick and rugged, of a fawn color, tending to red. The hair is short and scanty. Some of them were 12 feet long. Quieter and less timid than their northern relatives, they did not post sentinels to warn them of approaching danger. Having examined this city of Morses, I thought it time to retrace my steps. It was 11 o'clock, and if Captain Nemo could find a favorable moment for his observations, I wished to be present at the time. However, I had little hope of the sun showing that day. The clouds, heaped up above the horizon, hid him from our sight. It seemed as if the jealous orb did not wish to reveal to human beings this inaccessible portion of the globe. Nevertheless, I made up my mind to return. We followed a narrow track from which ran along the top of the cliff. At 11:30 we reached the landing place. The canoe was drawn up and had landed the captain and his instruments. I saw him standing upon a block of basalt. His instruments were ready at hand. His gaze was fixed upon the northern horizon, near which the sun was then describing a long curve. I took my place beside him and waited without speaking. 12 o'clock came, and, as on the previous day, no sun was visible. It was fatality. The observation could not be made. If it could not be accomplished tomorrow, we must entirely give up the idea of knowing our situation. We were now at the 20th March. The morrow, the 21st, was the equinox, refraction not counted. The sun would then disappear behind the horizon for 6 months, and, at his departure, the long polar night set in. Since the September equinox, it had risen above the horizon, rising in elongated curves daily, till the 21st December, at that time the summer solstice of northern latitudes. It began to descend, and, on the 21st March, it would pour out its last rays. I made known my observations and fears to Captain Nemo. "You are quite right, Monsieur Aronnax," he replied. "If tomorrow I do not obtain the height of the sun, I cannot repeat my attempt here for 6 months, but also, precisely because the chances of my sailing have led me to these seas on the 21st March, my object will be all the easier to attain if, at midday, the sun will only show himself." "Why, Captain?" "Because when the orb describes such lengthened curves, it is difficult to measure exactly its height above the horizon, and the instruments are not unlikely to return erroneous results." "But how do you intend to proceed?" "I shall only use my chronometer," said the captain. "If tomorrow, 21st March, at noon, the disk of the sun, taking account for refraction, is exactly divided by the northern horizon, I shall know we are at the South Pole." "Quite so," said I, "but nevertheless this conclusion is not mathematically correct, since the equinox does not necessarily commence at midday." "No doubt, but the difference will not be 100 yards, and we do not want anything more than we shall get. Till tomorrow, then." Captain Nemo returned on board. Conseil and I remained until nearly 5 o'clock, surveying and studying the shore. I did not pick up any curious thing except a penguin's egg of erroneous size, for which a collector would have paid 1,000 francs. Its Isabelle color, its lines, and the characters which ornamented it, like so many hieroglyphics, made it quite a curiosity. I put it into Conseil's hands, and this prudent and sure-footed lad, holding it like a precious bit of china, carried it in safety on board the Nautilus. I placed the specimen in one of the glass cases of the saloon, and after an excellent supper of seal's liver, I went to sleep, first invoking the favor of the sun, like a Hindu. Next morning at 5 o'clock I ascended to the platform, and there found Captain Nemo. "The weather is clearing a little," he said. "I begin to hope, after breakfast, we will land to select a post of observation." This point settled, I went to find Ned Land. I wished him to come with me, but he refused, and I perceived that his sullenness increased every day. After all, I did not regret his decision under the circumstance. There were a number of seals on shore, and it was needless to submit the harpooner to such temptation. After breakfast we went ashore. The Nautilus had worked up the coast a few miles during the night. We were in the offing, quite a league from the shore, which was commanded by a high peak about 1,500 feet high. The boat carried, besides myself and Captain Nemo, 2 men in the instruments, viz., a chronometer, a field glass, and a barometer. During our row, I noticed numbers of the 3 austral species of whale, viz., the right whale of the English fisher, which has no dorsal fin, the humpback or a balenopteron, sorry about that, which with creased belly and large white fins, which, notwithstanding its name, do not form wings, and the finback, a brownish-yellow creature, the most lively of all cetaceans. This powerful animal can be heard at a great distance when he throws a giant height columns of air and vapor, which resembles clouds of smoke. These mammals disported themselves in the quiet sea, and I saw that the basin of the South Pole now served as a place of refuge for these cetacea, too closely pressed by fishermen. At 9 o'clock we landed. The sky was clearing, the clouds were flying to the south, and the fogs rose. Captain Nemo directed his steps to the peak, whence he wished to make his observation, no doubt. It was a rough ascent over the sharp lava blocks and pumice stones, amid an atmosphere saturated with sulphurous exhalations. The captain, for a man accustomed to walk on land, ascended the steep and difficult slopes with an activity and agility I could not emulate, and with a chamois hunter would have envied. We had 2 hours to wait at the summit. From thence we commanded an extensive prospect of sea, which towards the north was clearly defined against the horizon. At our feet lay snow fields of dazzling whiteness. Overhead was the pale blue sky. In the north the sun's disk like a ball of fire already horned by the cutting of the horizon. Magnificent jets of water rose by hundreds from the bosom of the sea, and in the distance the Nautilus lay like a sleeping whale. Behind us, to the south and east, extended an immense tract of land, a chaotic mingling of rock and ice without visible boundary. Captain Nemo, having reached the very top of the peak, carefully took the mean elevation of the barometer, for that he would have to take into account in an observation. At 11:45, the sun, seen only by refraction, showed itself like a disk of gold and threw its last rays upon the desolate continent and those seas which man had never yet entered. The captain, furnished with a reticulated glass, which, by means of a mirror, corrected refraction, began to observe the sun, which was sinking slowly below the horizon in a long diagonal. I held the chronometer. My heart beat loudly. If the difference of half the disk coincided with noon on the chronometer, we were at the pole itself. 12 o'clock, I cried. The South Pole, replied the captain in a grave tone, and handed me the glass. I perceived the orb of day precisely bisected by the horizon. I looked at the last rays tipping the peak and watched the shadows creeping up by degrees. At that moment, Captain Nemo turned to me and said, "Professor, in the year 1600, the Dutchman Gerrit, driven by the currents and storms, reached 64 degrees of south latitude and discovered New Shetland. In 1773, on the 17th of January, the illustrious Cook, following the 38th meridian, reached 67 degrees 30 minutes, and in 1774, on the 109th meridian, he got to the 71 degrees 15 minutes south latitude. The Russian Bellinghausen, in 1819, found himself in the 69th parallel, and in 1821 on the 66th parallel, in 110 degrees west longitude. In 1820, the Englishman Brunsfield stopped at the 65th degree. The same year, Morel, an American, whose narratives are dubious, mounted to the 42nd meridian, discovered the open sea in 70 degrees 14 minutes south latitude. In 1825, Powell, an Englishman, was not able to get beyond the 62nd degree. The same year, a simple seal fisher, Weddell, an Englishman, reached as far as 74 degrees 15 minutes on the 36th meridian. In 1829, Foster, his countryman, captain of the Chanticleer, took possession of the Antarctic continent in 63 degrees 26 south latitude and 66 degrees 26 minutes longitude. In 1831, Biscoe, upon the 1st of February, discovered the land he called Enderby in latitude 68 degrees 50 minutes. In 1832, on the 5th February, Adelaide in latitude 67 degrees, and on 21st February, Graham's Land in latitude 64 degrees 45 minutes. In 1838, the French explorer Dumont d'Urville stopped by ice in latitude 62 degrees 57 minutes, found the territory Louis Philippe. 2 years later, in a new place to the south, on the 24th January, he named Adelaide in 66 degrees 30 minutes, and 8 days later, in 64 degrees 40 minutes, the Clare coasts. In 1838, Wilkes, an Englishman, advanced as far as the 69th parallel on the 100th meridian. In 1839, Balleny, an Englishman, also discovered Sabrina Land on the edge of the polar circle. Finally, in 1842, James Ross, mounting Erebus and Terror on the 12th January in 76 degrees 56 latitude and 170 degrees 7 minutes east longitude, discovered Victoria Land. On the 23rd of the same month, he reached the 74th parallel, the highest point attained to that time. On the 27th day, he was in 76 degrees 8 minutes. On the 28th at 77 degrees 32 minutes. On the 2nd February, in 74 degrees 4 minutes. And in 1842, he reached the 71st degree, which he could not pass. So then I, Captain Nemo, on this 21st March, 1868, have reached the South Pole on the 90th degree, and I take possession of this part of the globe, equal to 1/6 of the known continents. In whose name, Captain? In my own, he replied. As he spoke, he unfurled a black flag, embroidered with an N in gold. Then, turning to the sun, whose last rays were tinting the waves on the horizon, he exclaimed, Adieu, O sun, disappear, radiant orb. Sleep beneath this open sea, and leave a long night of 6 months' duration to extend its shadow over my new dominion. We're at a chapter break, so I will say more formally, hello Reaper, hello Drink. I'm so glad you could make it. You made it just in time. Oh, and hi John, how are you doing? Good to see you too. You made it just in time to hear me stumble over a whole bunch of words in here. Yeah, it looks like after this story time, we'll have one more story time of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So that's exciting. All right, and we shall continue. Chapter 15. Accident or incident? Ooh, this sounds intriguing. Next morning at 6 o'clock, the preparations for our departure commenced. The last hours of twilight were buried in the night. The cold was intense. The stars shone with wonderful brilliancy, and in the zenith glittered the Southern Cross, the polar star of the Antarctic region. How true, huh? The thermometer marked at 12 degrees below zero, and I have to wonder if they use centigrade or Fahrenheit when they take these temperature measurements. At least the time before they specified that it was centigrade. The thermometer marked 12 degrees below zero, and when the wind got up, it bit shrewdly. The ice blocks increased upon the ocean. Numerous black patches spread themselves over the surface, and they announced the formation of the young ice. Evidently, the southern basin, frozen during the 6 months of winter, was absolutely inaccessible. What became of the whales during that period? Doubtless they went below the icebergs to seek more open seas. As for the seals and morses, accustomed to live in the most icy climates, they remained where they were. The instinct of those animals bid them to cut holes in the ice and keep them always open. They come to these holes to breathe, and when the birds, chased away by the cold, have migrated to the north, the mammals are the sole occupants of the polar continent. However, the reservoirs were filled, and the Nautilus slowly descended. At a depth of 1,000 feet it stopped. The screw beat the water, and it went right away towards the north at a rate of 15 miles an hour. Towards evening we floated beneath the immense icebergs. The saloon panels had been closed as a matter of prudence, for the Nautilus might strike some immersed block of ice, so I employed myself during the day putting my notes in order. My mind was fully occupied in recollections of the pole. We had reached the hitherto inaccessible point without fatigue or danger, as if our floating wagon had run along a line of railway. And now our return had actually begun. Had Captain Nemo any more wonders in store? What a series of submarine wonders had I witnessed during the 5 months I had been on board. We had sailed 14,000 leagues, and incidences of the most curious or terrible nature had given a charm to our journey. The chase in the Isle of Crespo, the threading of Torres Strait, the Coral Cemetery, the Ceylon fisheries, the Arabian Tunnel, the fires of Santorin, Vigo Bay, Atlantide, and the South Pole. During the night, all these reminiscences prevented my sleeping. At 3 a.m., I was disturbed by a violent shock. I sat up and listened, when I was roughly thrown into the middle of the room. The Nautilus, having struck, had rebounded violently. I groped my way to the saloon, which was lighted from the ceiling. The furniture was upset. Happily, the glass cases were firmly fixed and had not given way. The pictures on the wall, on the starboard side, the vessel being no longer upright, they put 2 no's in a row. It confused me. Were hanging close to the paper, while those opposite were a foot from the wall. The Nautilus was lying on the starboard side, motionless. I could hear a noise of footsteps and hurried voices, but Captain Nemo did not appear. Just as I was about to leave the saloon, Ned and Conseil entered. "What's the matter?" I asked. "We came to ask Monsieur," said Conseil. "Thousand devils! I know what it is very well," said the Canadian. "The Nautilus has struck, and judging from the heel she has, I do not think she will recover as easily as she did in the Torres Strait." "But at least," I said, "we shall go up to the surface." "We do not know," replied Conseil. "We can easily find out," I said. I consulted the manometer. To my great surprise, it indicated a depth of 11,000 feet. "What is the meaning of this?" I cried. "We must ask Captain Nemo," said Conseil. "But where will you find him?" said Ned. "Follow me," I said. We quitted the saloon. There was no one in the library, no one at the central staircase. I fancied that the captain was in the pilot house, so it was better to wait. We therefore returned to the saloon. I pass over the recriminations of the Canadian. I let him exhaust his ill humor at his ease without replying. We remained thus for 20 minutes, endeavoring to catch the slightest noise, when Captain Nemo entered. He did not appear to see us. He showed signs of uneasiness. He examined the compass, the manometer in silence, and placed his finger on the point on the map of the southern seas. I did not like to interrupt him, but as he leaned towards me, I made use of the expression he had used in Torres Strait. "An incident, Captain?" "No, sir," he replied. "An accident this time." "Serious?" "Perhaps." "Is there immediate danger?" "No." "The Nautilus is stranded, I suppose?" "Yes." and how has it occurred? From a caprice of nature, not from our ignorance. No mistake has been made in our course, but we cannot prevent the effects of the laws of equilibrium. We may brave human laws, but not those of nature. This was a curious moment for Captain Nemo to select to give vent to his philosophical reflection, and, on the whole, I got little from his reply. This was a curious moment. I just read that, sorry. May I know how this accident came about? I asked. A whole mountain of ice is turned over, he replied. An iceberg when icebergs get undermined, either by warmth or repeated shock, the center of gravity ascends. Then they topple over. That is what has occurred. One of those blocks, as it fell, struck the Nautilus under water. Then, gliding beneath the hull, it raised it with irresistible force, and forced it into thinner ice, where the Nautilus now lies on her side. But cannot we empty the reservoirs and get her off by those means? That is now being done. You can hear the pumps at work. Look at the manometer. It shows that the Nautilus is rising, but the block of ice is rising with it, and until its progress is stopped, our situation will be practically the same. In fact, the Nautilus now gave a bound to leeward. She would right herself, no doubt, when the ice block was separated from her, but at that moment we could not tell whether we might not be crushed up against the iceberg and crushed between the blocks. I kept thinking of the consequences of the situation. Captain Nemo never took his gaze from the manometer. The Nautilus, since the fall of the iceberg, had risen above 150 feet, but at the same angle as before. Suddenly, a slight movement was felt. The vessel was evidently riding a little. The objects suspended in the saloon appeared to be recovering their normal positions. The sides got more upright. No one spoke a word. With beating hearts we watched and felt the ship recovering herself. The floor was at length horizontal. 2 minutes elapsed. At length we have righted, I cried. Yes, said the captain, as he advanced to the door. But are we floating? I asked. Certainly, he replied, since the reservoirs are now empty. When they are empty, we shall rise to the surface again. The captain went out, and I soon found that the ascent of the Nautilus had been stopped. We should soon have struck against the bottom of the iceberg had we gone up, and it was more prudent to remain beneath the waters. We have escaped very well, said Conseil. Yes, indeed. We might have been crushed beneath blocks of ice, or at any rate imprisoned, and then, in the absence of opportunity to renew the air. Yes, we have escaped very well. If it is all over, murmured Ned. I did not wish to enter on a useless discussion with the Canadian, so I did not reply. Besides, the panels were just then opened, and the exterior light entered. We were in open water, as I have said, but at about 6 yards on each side of the Nautilus rose a dazzling wall of ice. Above and below it was the same. Above us the lower surface of the iceberg covered us like an immense ceiling, while below, the overturned iceberg, having slipped a little, had found a rest upon the 2 lateral walls which kept it in that position. The Nautilus was thus imprisoned in a regular ice tunnel between 20 yards in length and filled with still water. It was therefore easy to get out of it by going backwards or forwards, and afterwards make, at some 100 yards lower down, a free passage beneath the iceberg. The ceiling light had been extinguished, and nevertheless the saloon was brilliantly illuminated. This was the powerful reflection from the glass partitions caused by the intense light of the electric lamp. I cannot describe the effect of the voltaic rays upon the capriciously shaped ice blocks. Each angle, ridge, and facet threw off a different gleam according to the vein of the ice. A sparkling mine of gems, and particularly of sapphires, which crossed their blue rays with the green of the emerald. There were also opal shades of infinite softness coursing amidst brilliant diamond points of fire, whose intense brilliancy the eye could not sustain. The power of the lantern was increased 100-fold, like a lamp through the lenticular sheets of a large lighthouse. "Is it not beautiful?" cried Conseil. "Yes," I said, "it is a magnificent sight, is it not, Ned?" "Yes, confound it, yes it is," replied Ned Land. "It is superb. I am angry at being forced to admit it. Nothing to equal it has ever been seen. But this sight may cost us dear. And if I must say all I think, I believe that we are now looking at things which God never intended man to see." Ned was right. It was too beautiful. Suddenly a cry from Conseil made me turn. "What is the matter?" I cried. "I'm blinded, I believe." I turned involuntarily to the window. The vessel was going at a great pace now. I understood what had happened. All the quiet glittering of the icy walls was now changing into flashing lightning. The glare of these myriad of diamonds was absolutely blinding. The Nautilus was sailing through a stream of lightning. The panels were closed. We held our hands above our eyes, still affected by the intense glare. It was some time before our eyes recovered their usual power. At length we removed our hands. "I should scarcely believe such a thing," said Conseil. "I do not believe it now," replied the Canadian. "When we return to Earth," added Conseil, "satisfied with all the wonders of nature, what shall we think of the miserable continents and the petty efforts of men? No, the habitable world is not enough for us." To hear such a speech from the impassible Fleming was a proof that some degree of excitement had increased our enthusiasm, but the Canadian did not fail to throw cold water on it. "The inhabited world!" cried he, nodding his head. "Be easy on that score, friend Conseil. We shall never get there again." It was then 5 a.m. We suddenly felt a shock. I understood that the spur of the Nautilus had struck a block of ice. This must have been caused by a false movement, for the submarine tunnel, encumbered as it was with ice blocks, did not offer very good navigation. I thought, therefore, that Captain Nemo, by changing his course, would turn these obstacles, or rather the windings of the tunnel. In any case, our advance could not be entirely stopped, but, contrary to my expectations, the Nautilus went astern again. "We're going back!" cried Conseil. "Yes," I replied. "I suppose that there is no outlet this way." "And then?" "Then," I said, "the plan is very simple. We must retrace our steps and get out by the south end. That is all." I spoke thus so as to appear more confident than I really felt. Meantime, the Nautilus retired at a greater pace, and soon at a very high speed. "This will be a drawback indeed," said Ned. "What can a few hours matter, more or less?" I said, "provided we get out at last." "Yes," said Ned, "provided we do get out at last." For a short time I walked from the saloon to the library. My companion sat down in silence. I soon threw myself upon a couch and took up a book, which I began to read mechanically. After the lapse of a quarter of an hour, Conseil approached and said, "Is that book interesting to monsieur?" "Very interesting indeed," I replied. "I can quite believe it," he said. "It is monsieur's own work that he is reading." "My book!" I exclaimed. But so it was. I was reading The Great Submarine Depths. I had not the slightest idea of it. I closed the book and resumed my walk. Ned and Conseil got up to go. "Stay here, my friends. Let us wait together till we are clear of this ice." "Just as monsieur pleases," said Conseil. Some hours passed. I often consulted the instruments hanging in the saloon. The manometer showed that the Nautilus maintained an uniform depth of 300 yards. The compass showed her on a southerly course. The log that we were going at 20 miles an hour, a great speed in such a confined space. But Captain Nemo knew what he was about, and every minute was worth a century to us. At 8:25, a second shock occurred, astern this time. I turned pale. My companions approached me. I seized Conseil's hand. We looked at each other, and our looks interpreted our thoughts better than words could have done. At that moment, the captain entered. I went to him. "Our course southward is barred?" I asked. "Yes, the iceberg is turning over, has closed every outlet." "We are blocked up, then?" I said. "Yes." This chapter reminds me of another book that I'm currently reading. I think it's called In the Deep. I don't really remember. But it is about a woman who dives, subterranean cave diving, which is extremely dangerous. And so she's talking about her training. She is one of very few professionals who do it. And I'm going to have to see if there are some videos of her on National Geographic, because I think she did say that. And I do have Disney Plus. Disney Plus has the National Geographic on there. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. Like the very first, it's the foreword. She's talking about being in a cave in the middle of an iceberg, which is like super, super dangerous because icebergs are not stationary things. They are floating blocks of ice. So there could be a shift or it could tip or something like that. And I mean, if you're in the middle of a cave in the middle of an iceberg, you're kind of SOL. It's really interesting. I need to get back to reading it. I'm currently reading Juliet Blackwell's newest mystery. She's fun. I love her. I love, by the way, her Facebook. If you want just some fun person to follow on Facebook, she has a lot of stuff that's worthwhile. All right, on to the next chapter. Chapter 16, Want of Air. So around the Nautilus, above and below, was an impenetrable wall of ice. We were imprisoned in the iceberg. The Canadian struck the table with his heavy fist. Conseil said nothing. I looked at the captain. His face wore its usual look. He was standing there with arms crossed, lost in thought. The Nautilus did not move. The captain roused himself and said in a calm tone, "Gentlemen, there are two ways for us to die under present circumstances." He spoke as if he were a professor of mathematics delivering a lecture to his pupils. "The first is to be crushed up, crushed up. The other is to die by suffocation. I do not speak of the possibility to die of hunger, for the supplies on board will last longer than we can. Let us therefore calculate our chances of being crushed or suffocated." "As far as suffocation goes, Captain," I replied, "there is not much fear of that, for our reservoirs are filled." "Quite so," said the captain, "but they only give us 2 days' supply. Now we have been under water 36 hours, and the atmospheres here require renovating already. In 48 hours, our reservoirs will be exhausted." "Well, Captain, we shall be free before that." "We will try at any rate by piercing the walls around us." "Which side?" I asked. "The sound must guide us. I will run the Nautilus on the lower bank, and my men, in their divers' dresses, must attack the iceberg at the thinnest spot." "Can we open the windows of the saloon?" "Easily. We are moving no longer." The captain went out. A hissing noise soon told us that the water was entering the reservoirs. The Nautilus sank slowly and rested on the ice at a depth of 350 yards, at which distance the lower pack of ice was immersed. "My friend," said I, "the case is serious, but I count on your courage and energy." "Monsieur," said the Canadian, "I am not going to weary you with complaints at such a time as this. I am ready to do anything for the common safety." "Thank you, Ned." Said the Canadian. I thought it was Conseil. "Thank you, Ned," I replied, extending my hand to him. "I may add that I am as handy with a pick as with a harpoon, so if I can be of any use to the captain, I am at his disposal." You will not refuse your assistance, Ned. Come." I conducted the Canadian to the room where the crew were putting in their diving dresses. I mentioned Ned's suggestion to the captain, who accepted it. The Canadian then put on his dress and was ready as soon as the rest. Each one carried on his back the ronquerolles apparatus, which furnished a reservoir of pure air. A considerable but necessary deduction had been made from the supply on board. The Ruhmkorff lamps were not necessary. When Ned was dressed, I returned to the saloon, the windows of which were now open, and with Conseil examined the ambient beds which supported the Nautilus. Some moments after we saw a dozen of the crew on the bank of ice. Ned Land was with them, distinguishable by his great height. Captain Nemo also accompanied the party. Before digging into the ice, he sounded it, as to be certain of the best direction in which to work. Sounding lines were let into the side wall, but the lead stopped after 15 yards. It was useless to attack the ceiling, since the iceberg was more than 1,200 feet high. Captain Nemo then sounded the lower part. 10 yards of ice separated us from the water. That, then, was the thickness of the ice field. It was therefore necessary to cut out a piece equal to the Nautilus line of flotation. There were thus about 6,000 cubic yards to detach, so as to give us an opening to descend to the ice field. The work was at once commenced and vigorously prosecuted. Instead of cutting close around the Nautilus, which would have been a difficult operation, Captain Nemo determined to describe an immense trench around it, at about 8 yards from the starboard side. Then the men worked with borers at several points of the circumference, and the picks soon went to work, and immense blocks were detached. By the curious effect of specific gravity, these blocks, lighter than water, flew, so to speak, to the top of the tunnel, which got as much thicker above as it got thinner underneath. After 2 hours' hard work, Ned Land gave in. His companions and he were replaced by new hands, to whom we were allied. The mate superintended us. The water appeared to me very cold, but I soon warmed myself at work. I could move freely, although under a pressure of 30 atmospheres. When I entered the Nautilus after 2 hours' work to get some food and repose, I perceived a great difference between the air on board and what had been supplied by the apparatus. The air in the Nautilus had not been renewed for 48 hours, and its vivifying qualities were considerably weakened. But after a lapse of 12 hours, we had only raised a block of ice a yard thick, on the marked portion, which was about 600 cubic yards. At this rate, we should take 5 nights and 4 days to finish the task. 5 nights and 4 days, I said to my companions, and we have but 2 days' supply of air in the reservoirs. Without counting, said Ned, that if we ever do get out of this damned prison, we shall still be under the iceberg and without communication with the open air. It was quite true. Who could foresee the minimum of time necessary for our deliverance? Might not we be suffocated before the Nautilus had time to reach the surface again? Were we doomed to perish in this tomb of ice which shut us in? The situation was terrible, but every one looked it in the face, and all were determined to do their duty to the end. As I had foreseen, another block a yard square was raised during the night, but in the morning, when, clothed in my diving dress, I explored the water in a temperature of 6 degrees or 7 degrees below zero, it seemed to me that the lateral walls were coming closer. The water at a distance from the trench, not warmed by the presence of the workers, had a tendency to solidify. Our chances of escape were diminishing by this discovery. And how were we to stop the solidification of the surrounding water, which, when frozen, would crack the Nautilus like glass? I did not point out this new danger to my companions, for what good was there to diminish their energy in the hard efforts to escape? But when I returned on board, I told Captain Nemo my fears. "I know it," he said in that calm tone of his which the gravest danger could not alter. "It is only one danger more, and I do not see any way to avoid it. The only chance of safety is to work quicker than the solidification. We must be first, that's all." We must be first. I had become accustomed to this manner of speech by this time. During that day I yielded a pick vigorously for many hours. This toil sustained me. Besides, to work was to quit the Nautilus and to breathe the pure air supplied by the apparatus, to abandon a vitiated atmosphere. Another yard was dug out by evening. When I returned on board, I was almost choked by the carbonic acid gas with which the air was saturated. If we had only some chemical appliance with which to get rid of this deleterious gas! We had no want for oxygen. The water contained a very large quantity, and by decomposition we might restore the air. I had thought about it, but it was of no use to attempt it, as the carbonic produced by our perspiration had permeated the vessel. To absorb it we must have some caustic potash, and work it about incessantly. Now we had none of this on board, and nothing else would do. In the evening, Captain Nemo let some fresh air escape from his reservoirs, and without it we certainly should not have lived. Next day, March 26th, I resumed my work in taking out the 5th yard. The sides and the upper ice began to thicken visibly. It was evident they would join together before the Nautilus could escape. Despair seized upon me for a moment, and my pickaxe fell from my grasp. What was the use of cutting away the ice if we were to be suffocated and crushed by the rapidly petrifying water? This was a punishment that even savages had never invented. It seemed to me that we were between the jaws of a monster which were irresistibly approaching. At that moment, Captain Nemo, directing and working by turns, passed near me. I touched his arm and pointed to the side walls of our prison. The wall on the port side had advanced to within 4 yards from the Nautilus. He understood and made a sign to follow him. We returned on board. I took off my dress and accompanied him into the saloon. "Monsieur Anorax," he said, "we must try something desperate, or we shall be sealed up as in cement." "Yes," said I, "but what can we do? If the Nautilus were only strong enough to resist the pressure." "Well," I said, not catching the idea. "Do you not understand," he continued, "that this freezing of the water would help us? It would burst through the ice that imprisoned us. It can burst the hardest stone when it freezes. We have, therefore, an agent of safety, not of destruction." "Yes, perhaps so, but the Nautilus could never hold out against this terrible pressure. It would be flattened like an iron plate." "I know it," replied the captain, "so we must only trust to ourselves. We must oppose this solidification. Not only are the lateral walls closing in on us, but there do not remain 10 feet of water either before or behind us. The congelation is gaining on all sides." "How long?" I asked. "Will the air in the reservoirs permit us to breathe?" The captain looked at me steadily. "After tomorrow," he said, "the reservoirs will be empty." A cold sweat came over me. And yet I ought not to have been surprised at his reply. On the 22nd of March, the Nautilus went under water at the pole. We had now reached the 26th. We had lived for 5 days under the reserve on board, and what air remained respirable must be kept for the working parties. Even now the impression is still so vivid that an involuntary fear seizes me, and my lungs seem to want air. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo was reflecting in silence and motionless. An idea had apparently occurred to him, but he seemed to reject it. At length he said, "Boiling water." "Boiling water!" I exclaimed. "Yes, we are shut up in a space relatively small. Would not steams of boiling water constantly injected by pumps of the Nautilus raise the temperature of the water and retard the congelation?" "We must try it," I said resolutely. "Let us do so, Professor." The thermometer showed 7 degrees outside. Captain Nemo led me to the galley, where the vast apparatus of distilling drinking water by evaporation were at work. They were filled with water, and the whole power of the electric heat was directed through the serpentines immersed in the liquid. In a few moments it had reached 100 degrees. It was sent to the pumps, while fresh supplies came in proportion. The heat was so great that the cold water drawn from the sea, after having only passed through the apparatus, came boiling to the pumps. The pumping commenced, and in 3 hours the thermometer marked 6 degrees below zero. We had gained a degree. 2 hours after the thermometer marked 4 degrees. "We shall succeed," I said to the captain, having most carefully watched the progress of the operation. "I think so," he said. "We shall not be crushed, and so have only suffocation to fear." During the night the temperature of the water rose to 1 degree below zero. The injections would not carry it any higher. But as the congelation of the sea water is only produced at 2 degrees, I was reassured against solidification. The following day, 27th March, 18 feet of ice had been cut away. 12 feet only remained. We had still 48 hours to work in. The air could not be renewed in the interior of the Nautilus, so this day would make it worse still. An intolerable weight pressed upon me. About 3 p.m. this feeling of distress affected me in a violent degree. I yawned enough to dislocate my jaws. I panted in endeavoring to inhale the burning fluid so necessary to respiration, and which became more and more rarefied. A mortal torpor oppressed me. I was powerless, almost unconscious. My brave Conseil, similarly affected and suffering as I did, never quitted my side. He took my hand. He gave me encouragement, and I heard him murmur, "Ah, if I were not obliged to breathe, I should be able to leave more air for Monsieur." Tears came to my eyes at hearing him speak thus. If our situation all round was so intolerable on board, you can imagine how willingly we donned our diving dresses for work. The blows of the pickaxes resounded on the frozen ice beds. Our arms were aching. The skin was peeling from our hands. But what was fatigue? What did wounds matter? We had air for our lungs. We breathed. Oh, we breathed. Nevertheless, no one prolonged this turn under water beyond this allotted time. His task finished, each one handed to a companion the reservoirs that supplied him with vital air. Captain Nemo set the example, and was the first to submit to his severe discipline. As the time came round, he handed his dress to another, and returned to the vitiated atmosphere on board, calm as ever, without a murmur, unflinchingly. On that day our usual work was accomplished with more than usual vigor. 6 feet only remained to be raised. Only 2 yards separated us from the open sea, but the air reservoirs were almost empty. What little remained must be kept for the working parties, not an atom for the Nautilus. When I returned on board, I felt half suffocated. What a night I passed! I do not know how to describe it. Such sufferings are better untold. Next day my breathing was oppressed. A sensation of dizziness oppressed my brain, and I went about like one intoxicated. My companions were affected in the same way, and some of the crew had rattling in the throat. This, the 6th day of our imprisonment, Captain Nemo, thinking the work progressed too slowly with mattock and picks, resolved to crush the bed of ice that separated us from the open water. He had preserved his coolness and energy throughout. He overcame physical pain by mortal force. He deliberated. He combined his reasonings. He acted. By his order, the Nautilus was lightened, that is to say, raised from the ice bed by an alteration in the specific gravity. So soon as it floated, it was towed over the top of the circumference of the trench, which had been excavated according to its line of flotation. Then the reservoirs of water were filled. It descended and was engulfed in the hole. Then all the crew came aboard, and the door of communication was shut. The Nautilus was then resting upon a bed of ice, which was about a yard in thickness and pierced in 1,000 places. The reservoirs were then opened, and 300 cubic feet of water admitted, increasing the weight of the vessel to about 1,800 tons. We waited. We listened, all suffering forgotten in the tensions of those moments, holding still. We had thrown our last stake for safety. Notwithstanding the buzzing that filled my brain, I soon heard groanings beneath the hull of the Nautilus. The ice cracked in a curious manner, with a sound like the tearing of paper, and the Nautilus broke through. "We have passed it," murmured Conseil in my ear. I was not able to reply. I seized his hand and pressed it convulsively. The Nautilus, carried down by the enormous weights within, sank like a stone. Then all the electric force was put on the pumps to clear the water out, and in a few minutes our fall was checked. Soon after, the manometer indicated an ascensional movement. The screw going at full speed made the vessel tremble even to its bolts, and we steamed to the north. But how long was this progress beneath the ice to last? Another day? I shall be dead before that. I lay half suffocated within the divan of the library. My face was blue, my faculty suspended. I saw and heard nothing. All idea of time had left me. My muscles refused to contract. Suddenly I came to myself. Some breaths of air seemed to penetrate my lungs. Had we gained the surface? Had we cleared an iceberg? No, it was Ned and Conseil, my two brave friends, who were sacrificing themselves to save me. Some molecules of air still remained in some of the apparatus, and instead of respiring them, they had preserved them for me, and though almost suffocating, they gave it to me drop by drop. I wished to push the apparatus away. They held my hands, and for a few moments I respired voluptuously. My eyes turned to the clock. It was 11 a.m. It was then the 28th March. The Nautilus was speeding at 40 miles an hour, tearing through the water. Where were Captain Nemo and his companions? Had they all succumbed? At this moment the manometer indicated that we were only 20 feet from the surface. A simple layer of ice separated us from the atmosphere. Could we not break through it? Perhaps so. In any case, the Nautilus would try. I could feel it assume an oblique position and elevated spur. The induction of water was sufficient for this change. Then, impelled by the powerful screw, it attacked the ice field like a formidable battering ram. It broke it by degrees, by retiring and then attacking it with renewed force against the ice field, which gave way, and at last, carried upwards by its impetus, it crushed down upon the icy fragments, which it splintered beneath its weight. The panels were open, torn open, I may say, and fresh air, pure air from the sea permeated all parts of the Nautilus once again. Just taking a moment to soothe my throat a little bit. Chapter 17. From Cape Horn to the Amazon. How I got up to the platform, I have not a notion. Perhaps the Canadian carried me thither, but I breathed. I inhaled the life-restoring sea air. Close to me, my two companions were drinking in the fresh molecules. Men deprived of food for a long time must not too suddenly partake of nourishment. We, on the contrary, had no necessity to limit ourselves. We could inspire to our lungs' content the blessed air, and the breeze alone gave us this delightful sensation of mental intoxication. "Ah," cried Conseil, "how pleasant the oxygen is, and monsieur needs not fear to breathe it. There is enough for us all." Ned Land did not speak, but he opened his jaws wide enough to astonish a shark. And what breaths he took! The Canadian drew like a furnace in full blast. Strength quickly returned, and when I looked round me I saw that we were the only occupants of the platform. Not one of the crew was there, not even Captain Nemo. The strange sailors of the Nautilus contented themselves with the air circulating in the interior. Not one of them had come to imbibe the fresh air. My first words were of thanks and gratitude to my two companions. Ned and Conseil had prolonged my existence for the last hours of this long agony. All my thanks could not repay such devotion. "Ah," said the Canadian, "it is not worth speaking about. What merit is there in what we did? None at all. It was only a question of arithmetic. Your life was worth more than ours, therefore it was necessary to preserve it." "No, Ned," I replied, "it is not worth so much. No one is superior to a good and generous man, and you are that." All right, repeated the Canadian in an embarrassed manner. "And you, my brave Conseil, you have also suffered. But nothing compared to monsieur. I certainly did want air, but I believe that I did right. Besides, I looked at monsieur, who was fainting, and that gave me no encouragement to breathe." "My friends," I replied, much agitated, "we are bound to one another forever, and I am under great obligations to you." "I shall take advantage of that," replied the Canadian. "How?" asked Conseil. "Yes," replied Ned, "I claim the right to take you with me when I leave the Nautilus." "But are we going in the right direction?" asked Conseil. "Yes," I replied, "since we follow the sun, and here the sun is to the north." "Certainly," replied Ned, "but it remains to be seen whether we reach the Pacific or the Atlantic, that is to say, a frequented or a deserted ocean." I could not reply to this, and I was afraid that Captain Nemo would carry us rather towards the vast ocean which washes the shore of Asia and America. We would thus complete his tour round the world, and return to the seas where the Nautilus found the greatest liberty. But if we should return to the Pacific, what would become of all the projects of Ned Land? This important point ought to be fixed before long. The Nautilus was going at a great rate. The polar circle was soon cleared, and our course made for Cape Horn. We were off the point of America on March 31st at 7 o'clock p.m. Then all our past sufferings were forgotten. The remembrance of our icy imprisonment melted away. We only thought of the future. Captain Nemo appeared neither on the platform nor in the saloon. The mark upon the chart each day showed me the position of the Nautilus. Now, that evening, to my great satisfaction, it was evident that we were returning to the north by the Atlantic. I apprised Conseil and the Canadian of this. "Great news," said the latter, "but whither is the Nautilus bound?" "That I cannot say, Ned." "Does the captain wish, having seen the South Pole, to discover the North Pole too, and return to the Pacific by the celebrated Northwest Passage, I wonder?" "I should not be surprised," said Conseil. "Well," said the Canadian, "we shall have given him the slip first." "At any rate, we must acknowledge that Captain Nemo is a first-rate fellow, and we do not regret having made his acquaintance," said Conseil. Particularly when we have left him," said Ned. Next day, April 1st, the Nautilus came up to the surface. Some minutes before noon we noticed land to the westward. This was Terra del Fuego, which was so named by early navigators for the quantity of smoke arising from the native huts. It is a vast agglomeration of islands extending for a length of 30 and a breadth of 80 leagues. The coast seemed low, but in the distance high mountains appeared. I believe I saw Mount Sarmiento, which is more than 6,000 feet high, a pyramidical block of schist with a very peaked top, which, according to its cloud, which according as it is clouded or clear, announces bad or fine weather, Ned Land told me. A capital barometer, my friend. Yes, a natural one, and which was always right all the time I passed in the Straits of Magellan. On this occasion the top was clearly defined against the heavens, so fine weather was in store for us, and we enjoyed it too. The Nautilus again descended and coasted along. From the saloon windows I could see long seaweeds and gigantic fucus, and the varech, of which the polar seas contained many specimens, with their viscous and polished filaments. They measured nearly 300 yards in length, regular cables, thicker than the thumb and very tough. They often served to fasten ships by. Another plant called velp, with leaves 4 feet in length, enclosed in the corallus concretions, carpeted the depths. They served as nests and food for myriad of crustacea. Whether the seals and otters lived in clover, mingling the flesh of fish with the vegetations of the sea, an English fashion. The Nautilus passed rapidly over these luxuriant regions. Towards evening we neared the Malouine Isles, whose summits I could see the following day. The sea was of medium depth, I thought, and not unreasonably, that these 2 large islands, surrounded by a number of small ones, were formerly part of the land of Magellan. The Malouines were probably first discovered by John Davis, who called them Davis's Southern Isles. Later, Richard Hawkins called them the Maiden or Virgin Islands, and afterwards they were named Malouines at the beginning of the 18th century by the St. Malo fishers, and finally designated Falkland Isles by the English, to whom they now belong. In these places the nests brought up some beautiful specimens of algae, and particularly a certain fucus, whose roots contain some mussels, which are the best in the world. Geese and ducks fell upon the platform in dozens, and were soon in the larder. Amongst the fish I noticed the gobies and buberots, spotted yellow and white. There were also numerous medusae, and the chrysanes, which are peculiar to this region. They sometimes appeared like an enormous umbrella, streaked with reddish-brown lines and terminating in a dozen regular festoons. Sometimes like an inverted cap, from which large leaves and long red twigs escaped in graceful curves. They swam by, moving their 4 foliaceous arms and letting their long, curling tentacles drift behind them. I wished to preserve some specimens, but they evaporated when out of their native element, like shadows or apparitions. When the Falklands had disappeared beneath the horizon, the Nautilus plunged down about 25 yards and followed the American coast. Captain Nemo did not appear. He did not leave the Patagonian coast till April 3rd, and we were sometimes above, sometimes under water. We passed the large estuary formed by the La Plata, and on the 4th we were opposite Uruguay, but at a distance of 50 miles from land. We still steered north, and followed the trendings of the American coast. We had now made 16,000 leagues since our departure from the Japanese seas. We crossed the Tropic of Cancer on the 37th meridian about 11 a.m. and passed Cape Frio. To Ned Land's disgust, Captain Nemo did not hug these Brazilian shores, and we went at a great pace. Not a bird nor fish, however rapid, could keep up with us, and all natural curiosities escaped me. This pace was sustained for several days, and on the 9th April, in the afternoon, we sighted Cape Roque, the most easterly point of South America. But here the Nautilus altered her course again and sought the deeps of a submarine valley which extends between this cape and Sierra Leone. This valley bifurcates as high up as the Antilles and ends at the north of a tremendous dip of 2,700 feet. In this place, the geological cutting of the ocean forms a perpendicular cliff of 3.5 miles as far as the Lesser Antilles. And at the Cape Verde Islands is another wall, no less considerable, which thus shuts in the whole of the submerged continent of Atlantis. The bottom of this immense valley is sprinkled with mountains, which gives some picturesqueness to these oceanic depths. I am speaking from information derived from the charts of the Nautilus, charts which Captain Nemo had laid down after personal inspection. For 2 days we visited the deep and deserted waters, but on the 11th of April we rose suddenly to the surface and descried the land of the mouth of the Amazon, an estuary large enough to freshen the sea water for several leagues. We crossed the equator. The Guineas, a French settlement, lay 20 miles to the east, and on which we could have found refuge easily. Sorry, I'm going to do that again. There we go. The Guineas, a French settlement, lay 20 miles to the west, and on which we could have easily found refuge. But the wind was blowing fearfully, and the waves were so high that no ordinary boat could live in them. Ned Land saw that, no doubt, for he made no remark to me. For my part, I made no allusion to his plan, for I did not wish to urge him to make an attempt which could only end in failure. I amused myself very easily in the interval by interesting studies. During the 11th and the 12th April, the Nautilus remained at the surface, and the nets brought in a miraculous draft of zoophytes, fish, and reptiles. Some zoophytes had been dragged up by the chain. These were chiefly phyctolines, belonging to the Actididian family, and amongst other species were the Phyctalis protexta, a native of these parts of the ocean, a little cylindrical trunk striped with vertical lines and studded with red dots, which cover a marvelous show of tentacles. The mollusks consisting of those I have already mentioned, such as turtillas, olive porphyras, pteroceras, like petrified scorpions, and scuttlefish, which are very good to eat. I noted various specimens of fish on these shores, which I was not hitherto studied. Amongst the cartilaginous specimens were the Petromyzos prica, a kind of eel, 15 inches in length, greenish head, fins violet, the back a bluish-gray color, the belly is brown, of a silvery hue and speckled. The pupils of the eyes are surrounded with a golden circle. A curious animal, this, which the current of the river Amazon had carried out to sea, for it is a freshwater fish. There were tubercular rays, with pointed nose, a long and loose tail, armed with a long toothed sting, like sharks, about 3 feet long, commonly known as pantoufle. Lophic vespertilios, a sort of reddish isosceles triangle, half a yard long, which looks like a bat, owing to the prolongation of their pectoral fins, but the horny appendage placed near the nostrils has caused them to be denominated sea unicorns. Finally, some specimen of Balliste, Corasavian, spotted with brilliant gold dots, the Capriscus, of pure violet, with varying colors of the pigeon's throat. I will end this somewhat dry but exact catalogue with a series of osseous fishes that I observed, the passans belonging to the apternotes, with blunt, snow-white noses. The body is of a beautiful black, furnished with a long, slender, fleshy stripe, Odotangithes, with spikes, immense sardines glittering with silver scales, mackerel provided with 2 anal fins, black centronotes, for which they fish with torches. These fish are about 2 yards in length, fat, with white brim, firm flesh. When fresh, they taste like eels, but dried, like smoked salmon. And labras, covered with scales at the bases of the anal and dorsal fins. Chrysoptera, in which gold and silver scales blend in brightness. Anapleps of Suriname, etc. But this etc. must not prevent me from mentioning another fish, which Conseil for a long time kept in remembrance, and with some good reason. One of our nets had hauled up a kind of ray fish, very flat, which, with its tail cut off, would have formed a perfect disc, and which weighed nearly 40 pounds. It was white underneath, red above, with large round spots of blue surrounded with black and very smooth skin. It struggled as it lay upon the platform, and endeavoring to turn itself, making so many efforts that it nearly fell back into the sea. But Conseil, wishing to keep it, threw himself upon it, and before I could prevent him, had seized it with both hands. He was immediately knocked back, his legs high in the air, with half his body paralyzed, and he cried out, "Oh, master, master, come to me!" This was the first time he had not addressed me in the third person. The Canadian and I raised him up. We rubbed his paralyzed arms, and when this inveterate classifier recovered his senses, he murmured, "Class cartilaginous, order Conodopteryginians, suborder Salacians, family rays, genus torpedoes." "Yes, my friend," I replied, "it is the torpedo that has knocked you over in this way." "Ah, monsieur may believe me, I will be revenged on that animal." "How?" "By eating him," which was done that same evening, but in pure respiral, for, to tell the truth, he was very tough. Oh, reprisal. The unfortunate Conseil had been attacked by a torpedo of the most dangerous species, the cumana. This curious animal is a medium conductor, like water. In a medium conductor, like water, can give a shock to fish at several yards' distance. So great is its power in the electric organs, the 2 principal surfaces of which measure 27 square feet at least. During the following day, the 12th April, the Nautilus approached the Dutch coast near the mouth of the Maroni. There were several herds of lamantins here. They were manatees, which, like the dugong and the stellara, belong to the Sirenian order. These beautiful animals, peaceable and inoffensive, measured between 18 and 21 feet in length, and weighed at least 3 tons. I told Ned Land and Conseil that nature had assigned a very important part to these mammals. They, like the seals, are intended to feed upon the submarine prairies, and so destroy the accumulation of plants which block the mouths of tropical rivers. "And you know," I added, "that what has happened since men have almost entirely destroyed this useful race? The grasses have putrefied and poisoned the air, and that has given rise to yellow fever, which has laid waste beautiful districts. Poisonous vegetation multiplies in these tropical seas, and the evil is irresistibly discovered from the mouth of the La Plata to Florida." And if we can credit Tosinel, this plague is nothing at all to what will happen to our descendants when the sea become depopulated of whales and seals. Then, infested with cuttles, medusae, and calmars, the waves will become vast hotbeds of infection, since they will no longer possess those vast stomachs that God has commanded to scour the surface of the seas. But without disputing this theory, the crew of the Nautilus caught half a dozen manatees. They did so to provision the ship with excellent meat, superior to beef or veal. The capture was not interesting. The manatees permitted themselves to be killed without resistance. Many thousand pounds weight of meat destined to be dried was stored on board. This day a tremendous haul of fish increased the reserves of the Nautilus, and the seas are so very rich. The net brought up a number of fish whose heads terminated in an oval plate with fleshy edges. These were echinids of the third family of the subbrachian Malacopterygians. This was the Echinidae osteocer. Yeah, we'll go with that one. Peculiar to those seas. When taken, the sailors put them in buckets filled with water. When the fishing was over, the Nautilus approached the coast. A number of tortoises were sleeping on the surface. Otherwise, it would have been difficult to capture them, for the least noise awakens them, and their shells were proof against the harpoon. But the Echinidae captured them with extraordinary precision. This animal is, in fact, a living fish-hook, which would make a tyro's fortune. The sailors tried to tail a ring sufficiently large not to encumber its movements, and to this ring was fastened a long cord fastened to the Nautilus. The Echinidae, thrown into the sea, fixed themselves to the breastplates of the tortoises. Their tenacity was so great that they suffered themselves to be torn to pieces rather than let go. They were hauled on board with the tortoises to which they had attached themselves. Several caconines were also taken, weighing 400 pounds. Their shells, covered with horny plates, thin, brown, and transparent, fetch a high price. They are also excellent eating, like the flesh turtles. This fishing brought our sojourn at the Amazon to a close, and, as night fell, the Nautilus steered for the open sea. Looks like we have enough time for one more chapter. Yep. All right. Chapter 18, The Octopus. For some days, the Nautilus gave the American coast a wide berth. Captain Nemo evidently did not wish to encounter the waves of the Gulf of Mexico or of the Antilles seas. There was no want of water there, for the average depth is about 1,800 yards, but probably the islands, with which the seas are studded, did not recommend them to the captain. On the 16th April, we sighted Martinique and Guadeloupe at 30 miles distant. I saw high peaks for a moment. The Canadian, who had counted upon putting his plans of escape into execution in the Gulf, either by landing on some island or by hailing one of the numerous vessels which ply from one island to another, was very much put out. Flight would have been practicable had Ned been able to get possession of the boat without the captain's knowledge, but in the open sea it was useless to think of it. Ned, Conseil, and I had a long conversation on this subject. We had now been 6 months on board the Nautilus. We had sailed 17,000 leagues, and, as Ned remarked, it was time to put an end to it. He suggested that we should go and put the question boldly to Captain Nemo, whether he intended to keep us on board forever. But to this I would not agree. We had nothing to hope from the captain. We must trust to ourselves. Besides, for some time he had become gloomy, reserved, and unsociable. He seemed to avoid me. I only encountered him at rare intervals. Formerly he seemed pleased to be able to explain the wonders of the sea. Now he left me to my studies in the saloon. What change was come upon him, and why? I had no reason to reproach myself. Perhaps our presence on board worried him. Nevertheless, I did not think he would give us our liberty. I therefore begged Ned to pause before acting. If this attempt had no result, it would only revive his suspicions, and render our position unpleasant and injurious to the projects of the Canadian. I will add that I could adduce no argument on the score of health. If I expect the rough experience beneath the iceberg, we had never been better in our lives. The healthy food, the pure air, the regularity of our lives with the uniformity of temperature gave illness no chance, and for a man who did not regret the world, or, like Captain Nemo, who was at home, who went where he chose, I could understand the pleasure of such an existence. But for us, we had not broken with mankind. I did not wish to bury with me my curious and novel studies. I had now the right to write a true book of the sea, and I wished sooner or later to have it published. Then again, in the waters of the Antilles, at 10 yards beneath the surface by the open panels, what interesting objects had I to note daily? Here, amongst other zoophytes, were those known as Physalis pelagica, like long oblong bladders with mother-of-pearl rays, lifting their membranes to the breeze and letting their long blue tentacles float like silken threads, beautiful medusae to look at, but regular nettles to touch and distilling a corrosive liquid. Amongst the articulates were annelids, 1.5 yards in length, armed with a rose-colored horn and furnished with 1,700 organs of locomotion, which twined about in the water and reflected all the colors of the solar spectrum. Amongst the fish were Malabar rays, enormous cartilaginous fish, 10 feet long and 600-pound weight, a triangular pectoral fin on a lumpy back, eyes fixed beyond the head at the extremities of the face, and which floated like wreckage and appearing sometimes like a shutter before our window. There were the American ballistae, dressed by Dame Nature in black and white, gobies, mackerels of enormous size, and the albacore species. Then we had gray mullet and shoals, striped with gold from head to tail, moving their resplendent fins, which shone like the masterpiece of jewelers' workmanship. Those were formerly consecrated to Diana, and were particularly sought after by rich Romans, and of which the proverb states, "Who takes them does not eat them." Lastly, Pomacanthe doris, ornamented with emerald bands, dressed in silk and velvet, passed like Veronese lords. What a number of other specimens I might have noted, had not the Nautilus dived to the lowest depths. Here, no animal life is not represented except by acrines, starfish, pentacrines, medusae heads, trochs, and such like. On the 20th April, we had risen to the medium height of 1,500 yards. The nearest land was the Bahamas, lying like a number of paving stones at the surface of the sea. High cliffs rose up, perpendicular walls, rough blocks placed in long layers, amongst which were deep holes to the end of which our electric lights could not penetrate. These rocks were clothed with immense sea grasses and weeds, hydrophytes worthy of a Titan world. From speaking of enormous plants, Ned and Conseil naturally turned to gigantic animals in the sea. The former were evidently intended to nourish the latter, which from the windows of the saloon I did not see any but the principal articulates of the division of Brachiosa, long-footed lampreys, violet crabs, and Cleos, particularly the Antilles. Around 11 a.m., Ned Land directed my attention to the extraordinary amount of movement going on amongst the algae. "Well," I said, They are the regular caves of cuttlefish, and I should not be surprised to see one of those monsters. What? Cried Conseil. Calmars, simple calmars of the class of cephalopods? No, I replied, but cuttlefish of enormous size, from perhaps friend Ned is mistaken, for I can perceive none of them. I am sorry for it. I should like to see one of those porpoises, of which I have heard, which are able to drag ships under water. They are called It is a regular cracker altogether, I should think, said Ned. Cracker will do. Krakens, replied Conseil, having got out the word without noticing his companion's chaff. You will never make me believe that such animals exist, said Ned. Why not? Exclaimed Conseil. You believed Monsieur's narwhal. We were wrong, Conseil. No doubt, but other people believe it still. It is probable, Conseil, but I have made up my mind not to admit the existence of these monsters till I have dissected them myself, said I. So, said Conseil, Monsieur does not believe in the gigantic octopi? Why, who the devil has ever believed in them? Asked Ned. Lots of people, friend Ned. No fishermen. Savants, perhaps, may. Excuse me, Ned, both fishermen and savants. But, said Conseil, with the most serious air in the world, I perfectly remember to have seen a large ship pulled down beneath the waves by one of the arms of a cuttle. You have seen that? Exclaimed the Canadian. Yes, Ned. With your own eyes? With my own eyes. And where, if you please? At St. Malo, replied the imperturbable Conseil. In a harbor, I suppose, said Ned ironically. No, in a church. In a church! Exclaimed Ned. Yes, there is a picture there representing the cuttle. Captain! Cried Ned, laughing. Capital. Conseil did puzzle me a bit. As a fact, he is quite right, I said. I have heard of that picture, but the subject is taken from a legend, and you know what to think of legends when applied to natural history. Besides, when monsters are in question, the imagination is apt to run wild a little. Not only has it been stated that these cuttles can drag ships down, but a certain Olaus Magnus speaks of a cephalopod a mile long, which was more than an island than an animal. It is also recounted that the Bishop of Nidros one day built an altar upon an enormous rock. Mass concluded, the rock got up and departed to the sea. The rock was Cuttle. Is that all? Replied Ned. No, another bishop, Pontoppidan de Bergam, also speaks of a cuttle upon which he could exercise a regiment of cavalry. They said something besides their prayers, did those bishops, replied Ned. Finally, the ancient naturalists quote monsters whose throats were like gulfs and which were too large to get through the Straits of Gibraltar. Oh, go ahead, said the Canadian. But now what is the truth of all this? Asked Conseil. Nothing, my friend. Nothing, at least, but what passes the limits of truth and reaches legend or fable. Still, there is at any rate some ground or pretext for this play of the imagination of storytellers. One cannot deny that cuttles and calmars of great size do exist, but they are not so large as cetacea. Aristotle mentioned a calmar of 5 cubits, nearly 10 yards in length. Fishermen have often met with them more than 4 feet long. The museums of Trieste and Montpellier have skeletons of pulpes measuring 2 yards. Besides, according to the calculations of naturalists, one of these animals, measuring 6 feet only, has tentacles 27 feet in length. That would be a formidable monster. Do they fish for them at present? Asked Ned. If they do not fish for them, sailors see them. One of my friends, Captain Paul Beau of Havre, has often told me that he met an enormous cuttle in the Indian seas, but the most astonishing incident, and one that will not allow us to deny the existence of these animals, happened in 1861. How was that? Asked Ned. In 1861, at the north end of Tenerife, not far from where we are now, the crew of the dispatch vessel Alecto perceived an enormous cuttle. Captain Bongueur approached it and attacked it with harpoons and guns without any marked success, for both bullets and harpoons recoiled from its flesh, which is like soft jelly. After many attempts, they succeeded in fastening a rope round the animal's body. The noose slipped to the caudal fins, and there it stopped. They then attempted to haul the monster on board, but its weight was so enormous that the tail was separated from the body, and deprived of its ornament, the cuttle disappeared beneath the waves. "At length we have a fact," said Ned, "an indisputable fact. So it was proposed to name the polg the Bonger cuttlefish." The polg. "How long was it?" asked the Canadian. "Did it not measure about 6 yards?" said Conseil, who was posted at the window watching the fissures in the cliffs. "Precisely," I replied. "Was not its head crowned with 8 tentacles which moved about in the water like a nest of serpents?" "Quite so." "Were not the eyes placed at the back of the head and very large?" "Yes, Conseil." "And was its mouth like a parrot's beak, but a very terrible one?" "Quite true, Conseil." "Well then, if monsieur pleases," replied Conseil quietly, "if yonder is not Bonger's cuttlefish, it is one of the family." I gazed at Conseil. Ned Land rushed to the window. "The horrible beast!" he cried. I, in my turn, came to look, and could not repress a shudder of disgust. For before my eyes was a fearful monster worthy to figure in legends of the marvelous. It was a cuttle of enormous dimensions, 8 yards long. It moved sideways with extreme velocity in the direction of the Nautilus. It gazed at us with its enormous, staring, sea-green eyes. Its 8 arms, or rather its 8 feet, were fixed to its head, which gives these animals the name of cephalopod, were double the length of its body and turned about like the headdress of the Furies. We could distinctly see the 250 air holes in the inner side of the arms, shaped like spherical capsules. Sometimes these air holes fastened against the window and thus emptied themselves. The monster's mouth, a horny beak like that of a parrot, opened vertically. Its horny tongue, itself armed with many ranges of sharp teeth, came quivering from out those veritable shears. What a freak of nature this! A bird's beak on a mollusk! Its body, shaped like a spindle and swollen in the middle, formed a fleshy mass which must have weighed 40,000 or 50,000 pounds. Its color changed with great rapidity, according to the irritation of the animal, passing successively from livid gray to a reddish-brown tinge. What irritated the mollusk? No doubt the presence of the Nautilus, more formidable than itself, and on which its beak and tentacles had no effect. What monsters these cuttles are! What vitality they possess! What vigors they must have in their movements, since they have 3 hearts! Chance had brought us in contact with this octopus, and I did not wish to lose the opportunity to study the specimen carefully. I overcame the horror with which its appearance inspired me, and seized a pencil. I commenced to make a sketch of it. "Perhaps this is the same that the Alecto encountered," said Conseil. "No," said the Canadian, "because this one is complete. The other fellow had lost a tail." "This is no reason," I replied. "These animals can reform their arms and tails by redintegration, and in 7 years the tail of Bonger's cuttle, no doubt, has had time to grow again." "Besides," replied Ned, "if this be not the one, it may be one of those others." As he spoke, another cuttle appeared at the window. I counted 7 of them. They attended on the Nautilus, and I heard the grinding of their beaks on the iron hull. We had enough now, at any rate. I continued my work. The monsters kept their places with such precision that they appeared immovable, and I was able to draw them foreshortened on the glass. Besides, we were not going fast. Suddenly the Nautilus stopped. A shock was felt all through her frame. "What have we struck?" I exclaimed. "In any case, we are free, for we are floating," said the Nautilus. The Nautilus was floating, certainly, but it was not moving. The screw was not going. A minute passed when Captain Nemo and his mate entered. I had not seen the captain for some time. He seemed preoccupied. Without speaking, perhaps without seeing us, he went to the panel, looked at the cuttlefish, and said something to the mate. The latter went out. The panels were soon closed, and the ceiling was lighted. I approached the captain. "Curious collection of cuttles," I said, in the easy way a person might speak of them in an aquarium. "Yes, indeed, Professor. We are going to fight them hand to hand." I looked at the captain, not thinking I had heard right. "Hand to hand?" I repeated. "Yes, the screw is stopped. I think one of their horny beaks has seized it. That is why we cannot move." "And what are you going to do? Rise to the surface and kill the vermin?" "Rather difficult, won't it?" "Yes, indeed, for the electric bullets do not meet with sufficient resistance in their pulpy bodies to take effect." "But we shall attack them with hatchets." "And a harpoon," replied the Canadian, "if you will accept my assistance." "I do, Master Land." "We will accompany you," I said, and with Captain Nemo we advanced to the staircase. There a dozen men, armed with boarding hatchets, were in readiness for the attack. Conseil and I armed ourselves likewise. Ned Land seized a harpoon. The Nautilus now floated to the surface. One of the sailors, placed on the top of the ladder, unscrewed the bolts of the panel, but the screws were scarcely loosened when the panel was wrenched violently open, evidently drawn in by the suckers of an octopus. Immediately one of the long arms glided through the aperture, and 20 others were moving above. With a single blow, Captain Nemo cut off its formidable tentacle, which slid writhing down the ladder. As we were pressing forwards together to reach the platform, 2 other arms, circling in the air, fell upon a sailor who was in front of Captain Nemo and raised him up with irresistible power. Captain Nemo uttered a shout and rushed in front. We followed. What a sight it was! The unhappy sailor, seized by the tentacle and fixed upon the sucker, was balanced in the air by this enormous trunk. He gasped. He was almost stifled, and cried out, "Help! Help!" These words, pronounced in French, astonished me greatly. I had a fellow countryman on board, several perhaps. I shall hear that heart-rending appeal all my life. The poor fellow was lost. Who could tear him from such a grasp as that? Nevertheless, Captain Nemo threw himself upon the octopus and cut off one arm at a blow. The mate waged a terrible fight with others, which were assailing the sides of the Nautilus. The ship's company fought with hatchets. The Canadian, Conseil, and I wearied our arms hacking at these fleshy masses. A strong odor of musk pervaded the air. The scene was horrible. For a moment I hoped that the unfortunate sailor seized by the octopus would be released. 7 of the 8 arms had been cut off, only one now brandishing like a feather twined aloft. But as Captain Nemo and his mate both rushed at the animal, it ejected a column of black liquid secreted in a bag near the abdomen at them. They were blinded, and when they recovered, the octopus had disappeared with our unfortunate friend. Enraged against the monsters, we pushed pell-mell amongst 10 or a dozen, which had now gained the platform and sides of the Nautilus, which were soon covered with waves of inky blood. The viscous tentacles seemed to spring up like hydra heads. Ned Land, at each thrust of his harpoon, blinded the great staring eyes, but my companion was suddenly overturned by the tentacles of the monster that he had not been able to avoid. My heart beat wildly. The beak of the octopus was extended over Ned Land. He would be cut in half. I rushed to his assistance, but Captain Nemo anticipated me. He flung his hatchet between the enormous mandibles, and the Canadian, miraculously rescued, plunged his harpoon into the triple heart of the octopus. "I owe myself that revenge," said the captain to Ned Land. Ned bowed, but made no reply. The fight had lasted a quarter of an hour. The monsters, conquered, mutilated, beaten to death, left us at last and disappeared. Captain Nemo, red with blood, stood motionless near the lantern, gazed down into the sea, which had swallowed up one of his companions, and great tears shone in his eyes. What a place to end story time. But we have come to the end of the chapter, and so I'm going to take a small break. Then when I come back, we're going to play some Littlewood, because they released version 1.0 today, and I'm excited to see what new has been released. I hope you'll stick around for that. If you're not sticking around, thank you so much for hanging out with me and for listening. I will let you know in chat when to refresh. I'll see you soon, I hope. Bye.